In the course of a heartfelt homage from President Ibrahim Traoré, nobody anticipated that Denzel Washington, the iconic actor celebrated for his fortitude and self-possession, would be rendered silent. Yet, as the gravity of the speech settled in, Denzel's voice quivered with a deeply stirred sentiment, exposing a facet of his character that the public seldom witnesses. This profound instance of reverence and sincerity has swiftly captivated a vast online audience, serving as a potent reminder of the inherent power found in authenticity and human connection. The grand hall was filled to capacity. A cacophony of camera flashes and the low hum of active microphones permeating the air as the world looked on. The event was intended to be a brief ceremony, just one more tribute on a quiet evening. However, none present were aware that an indelible moment was on the verge of unfolding. President Ibrahim Traoré made his way to the lectern. His tone was composed, unwavering, and imbued with warmth, carrying the dual significance of profound truth and sincere humility. Seated in the first row was Denzel Washington, the celebrated actor, renowned for his strength, poise, and authoritative presence. Sat with his arms folded, his expression inscrutable. Traoré commenced his address with one direct statement: "We are not gathered this evening merely to celebrate a man's accomplishments, but to celebrate his humanity." A stillness descended upon the room. It seemed as though even the relentless cameras held their breath while the president elaborated on themes of dignity, legacy, and the silent wars men wage behind composed exteriors. A subtle change occurred in Denzel's demeanor. He inclined his body forward, his jaw muscles tensed, and in that moment, for the first time in many years, the world was about to witness his vulnerability. The attendees had braced themselves for political discourse, but Traoré's address was not that of a politician. His delivery was that of kin, of a confidant, of a man who had traversed adversity, yet held fast to his compassion. "The measure of a man's strength," Traoré declared, his gaze sweeping over the assembly, "is not found in the volume of applause he commands, but in the acts of kindness he bestows when there is no audience." A visible turbulence manifested. In Denzel's breathing, he cast his eyes downward, blinking rapidly, as if battling an internal tempest. Traoré's discourse was not centered on influence or status. It was about heritage, truth, and the fortitude required to stay human, a society that so often demands we wear a mask. For a fleeting instant, the focus shifted from the stage to Denzel. A camera lens captured his trembling hand as it rose to shield his mouth. That single image was broadcast across screens globally, though its full meaning was not yet understood by the public. But Denzel knew the words had found their mark. It was widely held that Denzel Washington was imperturbable, whether in his film roles, during interviews, or at personal appearances. He presented himself as tall, resolute, and collected, but on this particular night, his carefully constructed fortifications started to crumble. As Traoré spoke of the quiet sacrifices men endure, the private regrets they bear, and the dignity they maintain even in their silence, Denzel's eyes began to glisten with tears. He attempted to suppress the emotion, looking toward the ceiling, inhaling deeply, and even forcing a brief smile, but the truth had already reached him. A profound quiet enveloped the auditorium as Denzel's lips parted, and he whispered, almost to himself, "Dear Lord." A wave of astonishment passed through the crowd. No one had ever witnessed him in such a state publicly, and then, with a voice that shook with emotion, he finally uttered, "I was unprepared for this." The world collectively held its breath. The evening was just beginning its transformative course. It felt as if the entire audience had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Each word uttered by President Traoré carried the weight of undeniable truth, yet was delivered with the gentleness of compassion. "True eminence," he stated softly, "is not determined by our personal ascent, but by our efforts to elevate others during our own climb." The camera returned to Denzel, whose lips were now pressed into a firm line, his eyes shining. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and staring at the floor, as if the words themselves were too immense to confront directly. Members of the audience began to exchange looks, but no one ventured to speak. The silence was so complete that not even the rustle of a paper could be heard. For decades, the public had perceived Denzel as a titan of strength. In that instant, however, they were seeing the individual behind the legendary persona. "President." Traoré paused, his eyes surveying the room, and his gaze appeared to land squarely on Denzel. The quiet became almost tangible, and then a single tear traced a path down Denzel's cheek. The tear was not missed. The Titan's facade had fractured. Traoré, rather than proceeding with his rehearsed speech, set his notes aside. He began to speak freely, from the most genuine part of his being. "Brother," he said, his voice steady yet thick with emotion, "our power doesn't come from concealing our pain. It comes from having the courage to reveal it." The word "brother" echoed through the hall. Denzel slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting the president's. For a brief span, it seemed as if they were the only two people in the entire venue. Denzel's throat constricted. He attempted to form words, but no sound emerged. He pressed his palms together, bowed his head, and took a deep breath to steady himself. Traoré went on, "You have carried the world on your shoulders with such grace. Tonight, allow us to carry you." Audible gasps moved through the crowd, followed by a wave of applause, not a thunderous ovation, but a soft, respectful one. Denzel shut his eyes, his chest heaving. He whispered barely audibly, "Thank you." Video of the exchange began to proliferate online almost immediately. Phones discreetly documented the tremor in Denzel's voice, the gentleness in Traoré's words, and the raw humanity of the entire affair. But within that room, something far more significant was taking place. President Traoré descended from the podium. The crowd watched, stunned, as he walked across the stage, bypassing the cameras and reporters, and went directly to Denzel. He placed a hand gently on Denzel's shoulder. "You do not have to be strong by yourself," Traoré said quietly. The two men's gazes locked. Denzel, overwhelmed, covered his face with his hands. His shoulders began to shake. The audience remained frozen, witnessing a legend deconstruct, not out of shame, but in a profound display of humanity. Several seats away, a woman started to weep softly. Soon she was joined by others. The room had transformed into a sanctuary of healing, not solely for Denzel, but for every person present who bore their own unspoken burdens. For the first time in many years, the world was seeing Denzel Washington not as an inviolable icon, but as a man-human, susceptible and deeply affected. And the night's impact was still unfolding, though millions would later view the clips online. No camera could ever fully convey the gravity of that moment. President Traoré kept his hand on Denzel's shoulder, a steady and firm presence. As if to anchor him, the silence stretched on, but it was not uncomfortable, it was hallowed. The audience leaned in, their hearts pounding. Reporters who typically vied for the next big headline found themselves too moved to compose a story. Even the security personnel stationed at the doors had tears glistening in their eyes. At last, Denzel lowered his hands from his face. His eyes were red, his jaw unsteady. The room tensed, anticipating what he might say, but all he could muster was a hoarse whisper. "You have no idea how much I needed this." Traoré gave a slow nod, his gaze never wavering from Denzel's. "Sometimes," he answered gently, "the most formidable among us are those most in need of healing." The entire room seemed to exhale in unison, as if releasing a collective weight they hadn't realized they were holding. In that instant, the world witnessed something that transcended celebrity and politics. They witnessed humanity. Denzel straightened his posture, visibly grappling with the decision to continue. For his entire career, he had been the bedrock, the immovable figure everyone looked up to. But President Traoré's words had breached defenses that not even Hollywood could penetrate. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice low and halting. "I have spent a lifetime teaching strength," he started. "But there are nights when I sit by myself, feeling as though I am failing the very people who admire me." The crowd stirred. This was not the Denzel the public knew. This was unvarnished, unfiltered reality. His eyes flickered toward as if seeking silent consent to go on. Traoré offered a small, reassuring nod. "Hearing you tonight, it reminded me that even I am deserving of rest. Even I deserve to be carried at times." A hush fell once more. People quietly wiped their eyes. Phones trembled in unsteady hands as the moment was preserved. For the first time in a very long time, Denzel was not delivering a performance. He was simply existing. Within a matter of hours, the internet was ablaze. Clips of Denzel's trembling, Voice proliferated across social media platforms. Hashtags became global trends. Yet inside that auditorium, the significance of the moment had not dissipated. President Traoré returned to the stage, his expression humble, almost as if he were oblivious to the tidal wave of emotion he had just set in motion. "My brothers and my sisters," he addressed the faces before him. "Let this evening be a reminder to us all that our humanity is our greatest asset. It is acceptable to weep. It is acceptable to rely on one another." The applause that followed, it was more robust this time, sustained, nearly deafening. But it was not the applause of spectators being entertained. It was the applause of souls discovering a shared connection. Denzel, still emotional, got to his feet. He grasped Traoré's hand with both of his, holding it firmly. The camera zoomed in, and the world would forever remember the image of two men, one a Hollywood titan, the other a young African leader standing side by side, linked not by renown or politics, but by human truth. The night was only just beginning to unveil its power. When the ovation finally subsided, a profound silence lingered. People shifted in their seats, almost hesitant to speak, as if words might shatter the delicate connection the room now shared. Denzel resumed his seat, but his hands continued to shake. His gaze remained fixed on the floor, his chest rising and falling with deep, irregular breaths. President Traoré, composed yet visibly moved, leaned slightly toward him and whispered something that the microphones failed to capture. For a second, Denzel closed his eyes. Then he placed a hand over his heart and offered a small nod. The gesture communicated more than any words could. "I hear you. I feel you. Thank you." A young woman, seated in the back later, recounted the experience online. It felt like the whole room was holding its breath, like time itself had paused. "I've never seen Denzel like that." And Traoré, he didn't just talk to him, he talked to all of us. The video clip amassed millions of views before the evening concluded. But for those present in the room, no screen could replicate the depth of what they had just experienced. Later that evening, after the majority of the audience had departed, Denzel requested a private meeting with President Traoré. They met in a small backstage room, far from the cameras and glaring lights. Denzel sat forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes still moist. "Mr. President," he began deliberately, "I've listened to countless speeches in my life, but yours tonight, it shattered my defenses in the most profound way." Traoré, with great humility, shook his head. "Brother, I did not come to shatter you. I came to remind you, and all of us, that even giants require rest." Denzel let out a soft chuckle through his tears. "You are wise beyond your years. People perceive me as strong, but inwardly I have been weary. Weary of shouldering so much." Traoré leaned in closer. "Then allow others to carry you sometimes. Even the mightiest trees find support in the forest." Those words struck Denzel with the force of lightning. He whispered, almost to himself, "Perhaps tonight I finally learned that." By the following morning, the world was on fire with the story. News organizations replayed the moment on a continuous loop. Social media was inundated with hashtags, like hashtag Denzel and Traore and hashtag Truth and Connection. One viral post declared, "This isn't just a tribute. This is a historic moment. A president and a legend reminding us that vulnerability is not a weakness, it is our humanity." Even individuals who had never taken an interest in African politics were suddenly discovering Ibrahim Traoré, the young president from Burkina Faso. Many lauded his humility and fortitude, hailing him as a true leader of the people. Meanwhile, Denzel issued a brief statement. "What I felt last night reminded me of the power of truth. I am indebted to President Traoré not merely for his words, but for his heart." The world watched closely, anxious to see what would transpire next. And behind the headlines, both men were arranging a follow-up meeting that would take everyone by surprise. The week was far from over. On the third night following the tribute, an envelope was discreetly slid under Denzel's hotel room door. No name was on the exterior, only a single word: brother. Inside was a handwritten note from President Ibrahim Traoré. The message was simple, yet laden with truth. "You have moved millions with your art, but what moves the world most is not your performance, it is your essence. Do not conceal your humanity." It is your most precious gift. Denzel sat on the edge of his bed, reading the words repeatedly, a lump forming in his throat. For years, he had shouldered the weight of perpetually being the strong one, the unwavering one. Now, this young leader from Burkina Faso was affirming that it was permissible to set that weight down. A small tear traced a path down his cheek as he whispered, "Maybe it's time I stopped pretending." What Denzel was unaware of was that this letter would soon become public. Moving millions more the next morning, before sunrise, Denzel dialed Traoré's number. He paused before initiating the call, but an inner impulse urged him forward. When the connection was made, Traoré answered softly, "Good morning, Brother Denzel." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence held more significance than words. Finally, Denzel broke it. "You have given me more in 3 days than I have found in years of searching." Traoré's voice was placid, composed. "That is because it was not I. It was truth. Truth has a way of breaking chains we are not even aware we are wearing." Denzel's breath hitched. "Do you comprehend what you have done? The world perceives me as unshakable. But you reminded me that even I am permitted to feel." Traoré smiled through the phone line. "The strongest man is not the one who is never brought to tears. It is the one who is brought to tears, but continues to stand." Unbeknownst to either of them, this conversation would soon be leaked, and the world would listen in astonishment. By that afternoon, clips from their private call had mysteriously appeared online. Initially, Denzel was irate. This was never intended for public consumption. But as he scrolled through the comments, his anger dissolved into something else entirely. "Hearing Denzel like this brings me to tears. Thank you, Traoré, for reminding us all of our humanity. This is the most powerful conversation I have ever heard. Two men from different worlds brought together by truth. If only more leaders spoke like Traoré, the world would be a different place." The internet was alight. Hashtags trended across continents. Millions confessed they had never been moved to tears by a phone call before, but this one had undone them that evening. Denzel called Traoré again, his voice lighter this time. "Brother, the world heard us." Traoré responded softly. "Then, perhaps the world was meant to—" The week was escalating toward a climax no one could have foreseen. The hall was teeming with dignitaries, leaders, and artists from across the globe. Cameras flashed, but no one dared to shift from their position. As President Ibrahim Traoré stood at the podium, his voice, calm yet saturated with truth, resonated through the silence. He spoke of dignity, of nations that had been silenced for too long, of children who persist in dreaming despite their hunger, and of a continent that refuses to be subjugated. Denzel Washington was seated in the front row. Initially, he maintained his typical steady composure, nodding in thoughtful agreement, but then the focus of Traoré's words changed. "Strength," Traoré stated, his voice nearly breaking, "is not determined by how loudly we can shout, but by the amount of pain we can endure without forfeiting our humanity." Those words struck Denzel like a physical force. He leaned back in his chair, blinking rapidly, but the tears came nonetheless. The audience took note, but there was no judgment. Instead, they felt it with him. Cameras zoomed in. The world watched a man known for his immense strength become unraveled by the raw sincerity of a young African leader. And for the first time in his extensive career, Denzel had no lines to deliver, only silence and tears. When the event concluded, people rushed to shake Traoré's hand. Denzel remained seated, composing himself. At last he stood and made his way toward the young president. The two men met away from the main crowd, near the side of the stage. "Mr. President," Denzel whispered, his voice still unsteady, "I have listened to many speeches in my lifetime, but this one, it broke me." He paused. "You didn't just address leaders, you addressed souls." Traoré placed a hand on Denzel's shoulder. "I only spoke what is true," he said gently, "but the truth is heavier when it is carried alone." Denzel closed his eyes as another tear escaped. "Thank you for helping me carry it today. The world needed to hear that. I needed to hear that." Their interaction was brief, but a photograph captured the moment. Two men, their heads bowed together, one a veteran actor, the other a young leader, united by something far greater than celebrity or politics, human truth. That photograph proliferated online with incredible speed. Millions who had never heard of Traoré before suddenly recognized his name. By the week's end, the world was still buzzing. News anchors replayed the speech. Social media was flooded with clips of Denzel wiping away his tears, accompanied by captions like, "Authenticity is power." Children in Burkina Faso proudly circulated videos saying, "That's our president." In America, families gathered to watch together, and even in remote parts of the world, people felt a sense of connection. Denzel later conceded in an interview, his voice still tinged with emotion. "I have portrayed many characters, but what President Traoré gave me was not a role, it was a reminder that truth brings healing, that dignity is paramount, and that we are all interconnected." In the span of just 7 days, a young African leader had touched millions of hearts, not with force, not with wealth, but with sincerity. And in that week, the world didn't just see a president, they saw hope as the camera faded to black. A quiet message appeared on the screen. If this story resonated with you, please click the like button, subscribe for more inspiring stories, and share your reflections in the comments. Your voice is important, and together, we can amplify truth and connection.